Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The terrifying last moments of Marie Antoinette's turbulent life. She was the queen who became a hated figure inside of the kingdom that she had dreamt of ruling for decades. But the reality for Marie Antoinette was that the French people could not stand her, and the support for the monarchy had hit an all-time low as the French Revolution broke out, and the effects of this are still felt today. The French Queen, on the 16th of October 1793, after being made a widow months before, was dragged out into the centre of Paris, and she was then marched up to the guillotine, the same execution device that had taken the head of her husband, King Louis XVI. Marie Antoinette's downfall was sharp and brutal, and her treatment inside of prison was rough and brutal. But no one could have anticipated this lavishly spending queen would be beheaded on the guillotine. But there were some elements of society which still remained in support for Marie, and there were European monarchs who were considering rescuing the former Austrian princess. But what were the final moments of the French queen's life like? Trust me, it was truly harrowing. The fall of the French monarchy was brutal, and it would take a while until the royal family were held under arrest and were seized. There were different events which shocked the king and queen. For example, a mob broke into their palace on the 20th of June 1792, and Marie believed that the rioters were going to kill her and her children. She was accused of betraying France, and she was threatened, but on the 13th of August, the royals would then be imprisoned inside the tower of the temple, and these conditions were said to have been very harsh, and they were much worse than the previous house arrest. They had been kept inside in a palace. The queen would lose some of her close friends. For example, Marie-Louise de Lamballe would be savagely killed and paraded throughout the streets of Paris. Her head was placed on a pike and was then walked through Paris to the temple for Marie Antoinette, the queen, to see. But the queen would faint when she heard what happened. Marie must have known that her time on earth could possibly be coming to an end, at the end of the anger of the mob inside of France. Her husband, King Louis XVI, was imprisoned, and he was separated from Marie and their family, and he would be tried in the December of 1792, and he was then found guilty of treason and other crimes by the National Convention. The decision was then made to execute the king, and this was a slim majority that decided this, but he would be executed on the 21st of January 1793, with his execution taking place at the Place de la Révolution in Paris. He was taken from the same prison that his wife and queen was being held in, but following her husband's death, Marie Antoinette was now a widow. She was referred to as Widow Capet, and she went into mourning, and she must have feared for her life. At this time, the terror would also sweep through France, and anyone suspected of harbouring royalist sentiments and beliefs, as well as those who were linked to the royal family and supporting them, were brought to trials. It was rough and swift justice, as many of those who were convicted were executed straight away. But Marie, inside of prison, would be the subject of a number of plots which would have helped her to escape. There were conservative groups and monarchists who came up with plans to try and break her out of the prison of the temple. But whilst she was imprisoned at the tower of the temple, she and her children were insulted regularly, and the guards would treat her roughly and would blow their smoke into the queen's face in an act of disgrace. She was no longer a queen, and was treated as a terrible prisoner, and to many she was a symbol of the old order. The guards who looked after her were also accepting of bribes which could result in letters being passed to Marie, but following her husband's execution, the National Convention then deliberated at length as to what to do with Marie Antoinette. Some offered exile, and some even considered that she should be used in a prisoner swap for French prisoners of war, and they wanted a deal striking with the Holy Roman Emperor. But the more hard-line members of the convention wanted the former queen executing, like her husband the king. The newly formed Committee of Public Safety that championed executions, and the Terror headed by Robespierre, called for the former queen to be brought to trial, and they wanted to retrain the 8-year-old Prince Louis to possibly become a king and become a revolutionary. But this child was then separated from Marie Antoinette on the 3rd of July 1793, and this caused a significant amount of heartbreak for her, as her child was snatched from her, and she would fight against this. It's believed that he was then subjected to rough treatment at the hands of the revolutionaries, but she would long to see her son again. But he would turn against her and would accuse his mother of crimes. But then Marie Antoinette would be transferred to prisons from the Temple on the 1st of August at 1 a.m. to the Conciergerie. She was labelled prisoner number 280, and this was referred to as the antechamber to the guillotine, as many condemned people were held here, waiting their executions. But when she left the tower, Marie bumped her head against the lintel of the door, and she replied to the guards when they asked if she was hurt that, "Nothing now can hurt me." Her captivity inside of this new prison was even tougher, and she was watched constantly and had no privacy, and guards would make horrific remarks to her, and she could hardly get changed and dressed without them being creepy. There was then an attempt to help her escape, but this was foiled, and with this she was then, on the 14th of October 1793, brought to trial. Many believed that the trial was already decided, and she was not allowed much time to prepare a defence, and the trial was tough on her. There were many shocking accusations levelled against her, and she was even accused of incest, and this shocked the former queen when this was attached to her. On the 16th of October she was declared guilty of 3 main charges: depletion of the national treasury, conspiracy against the security of the state, and high treason, and for this she was then sentenced to death. She expected to spend her life in prison, but with this she then left instructions to her sister-in-law to look after her children, and she would state she did nothing wrong. She collated her will, and this was later found under Robespierre's bed, but she would prepare then for her execution. When the day came for her to lose her head, she had to change clothes in front of the guards in a final act of shame. She wanted to wear a black dress, but they forced her to wear a plain white dress, as this symbolised the widowed Queen of France. She was then subjected to having her hair cut short, and her hands, as the hour of death approached, were bound behind her back painfully, and she was also put on a rope led around her neck. Her husband had been taken to his execution in a carriage, but Marie was not allowed this, and she had to sit in an open cart like a commoner. It took an hour to take her to her execution scaffold in the Place de la Revolution, and the crowds looked on and shouted insults at her. She stayed firm in her composure, and a priest was allocated to her to hear her final confession, and he sat with her in the cart. But Marie would ignore him all the way to the scaffold, as he was a revolutionary priest. She arrived at the guillotine around midday on the 16th of October 1793, and she was then walked up the steps of the scaffold where the execution device sat on top of. She was then greeted by the executioner and his assistant, who were there to take the head off the queen. She was then approached by them, and she accidentally stepped on the executioner's shoe, and she said, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." And these were her final words. After this, the executioners strapped her to a board, and this was then slid under the guillotine, and after final checks were made, the blade was released, and in one cut, the head of the former Queen of France was taken off, and it rolled into a basket below. The executioner then grabbed her head from this and showed it to the crowd, and proclaimed, "Viva la République!" Her remains were taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, and they were to be interred there in a common grave amongst normal people who had died, and she was not allowed a royal burial. Madame Tussaud would sneak into the cemetery and take a plaster death mask and cast of her face. But then her body was buried in an unmarked grave, and her head may have been placed by her feet in an act of shame. Her remains were later exhumed in 1815 and were then reburied in the necropolis of the French kings and the Basilia of St. Denis. The final moments of Marie Antoinette's life were shameful, and they were a long departure from the royal lifestyle that she was living. Her imprisonment was harsh throughout, and she was treated terribly by the guards. But to many people, she symbolized the evil of the old regime and the suffering of the people. Marie, throughout her time on the throne, did not help herself, and she was someone who attracted a huge amount of hatred, but her execution was a shocking one, and it was very brutal. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.